So then, if you awaken from this illusion,
Persistence of vision.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Persistence of Vision podcast, the podcast that asks why you are listening.
I love it. Why are you listening?
You're listening because we're here to inspire conversations, and we do so in every dimension of time and space.
Hello, folks. I am Lance Fever Myers.
Hello, folks. I'm LBDO.
This is Persistence of Vision podcast. Please go to our website, which is POV-Publishing.com. There you can read poetry, essays, and short stories, and all kinds of great stuff by world-class artists and writers. You can see all the links to all our past podcasts and links to buy my book, Why So Much, by Lance Myers. And
my book, The Goddamn Fool, by LBDO.
That's right. Please go do that right now. Pause, go buy our books, and then come back and listen to us talk about Tristram Shandy.
Yes, and we're not only talking about Tristram Shandy, but we are talking to a former arts and entertainment editor and book reviewer for the Austin American Statesman, the great Jody Seaborn.
What's up, Jody?
Hey, thank you for having me on, and that is the life and opinions of Tristram Shandy.
Aha.
Yeah, that's right.
I sit corrected.
Yes, because the opinion part is very important. We shouldn't forget that.
That's right.
Right. Tell us about why that's important. So this book is written in sort of first person, right? And it's all about this man, Tristram Shandy, from his point of view.
Right.
And what makes this book exceptional?
Well, for me, I first read this book in college, so 40 years ago. Seems odd to say.
So you were high.
Seems odd to say that. And then I read it about 25 years ago, and then reread it for this podcast. And I think that it is often described as the first postmodern novel. It is... there was a movie came out about 15 years ago, Tristram Shandy, made by Michael Winterbottom and starring Steve Coogan and Rob Brydon.
Yes.
And in the film, Steve Coogan is asked why Tristram Shandy, and he says, well, it's a postmodern novel before there was a modern to be post about.
Yes. Pre-modern, postmodern.
Pre-modern, postmodern. And anyone who's read the novel, I think that is their first impression, is, oh my God, this novel, which was written over the course of several years from 1759 to 1767, is so modern, so contemporary. It's meta, it's comic, it's satiric, it's everything that you would expect something like, a postmodern novel written 20, 30 years ago to be. So that is one of its main appeals for me.
So postmodern, written in 1750...
it was written in a series of volumes from 1759 to 1767. The first two volumes were self-published by Lawrence. We should say the author is Lawrence Stern.
Right.
Lawrence Stern was
we don't want to give him a swell head.
That's right. Lawrence Stern was a clergyman in Yorkshire. Kind of a nobody until this book was published, although the people in Yorkshire knew who he was. He had a reputation in Yorkshire. And he wrote the first two volumes in 1759, self-published them. He pestered a publisher in London to take a look. The publisher in London took a look, decided to publish them, and it became an overnight sensation. And then he published volumes 3 and 4 in 1761, volumes 5 and 6 in late 1761. There was a lapse between volumes 7 and 8. I think those came out in 1765, and then the last volume, volume 9, came out in 1767. And I should say that the volumes are fairly short. The book as a whole, when you put all the volumes together, is 500 pages roughly. So it's a manageable book, but that's its history.
Wonderful.
So,
go ahead.
I was going to ask, so the first thing you've told us about this thing is that it's postmodern, right? So tell us what you mean by that. Why is that?
Well, does anyone know what postmodern is?
That's why I want to know.
I have no idea what postmodern is.
Right.
For me, the appeal is comic. It's a very funny book. It's almost slapstick in portions. It's the life of Tristram Shandy, but we never really get through his life. When the book ends, Tristram is only about 5 years old. Although there's a segment in volumes 7 and 8 where there's a bit of a travelogue that takes place when Tristram is an adult. But for the most part, the book, most of the book occurs before Tristram's even born.
Right, yeah.
And the main characters are Tristram's father, Walter Shandy, and Uncle Toby, who is one of the finest characters in all of English literature. Uncle Toby is just I love Uncle Toby. Fantastic character. And so you've got these great characters, you've got these great situations that border on slapstick and on some occasions even cross into slapstick. It's satiric, it pokes fun at the novel, at the form. It's constantly comic. Stern, or I should say Tristram Shandy, is constantly commenting on the novel. He's constantly commenting about his struggles with writing the novel. It's digressive, but it's also progressive. He says at one point, I think in volume 1, that, dear reader, excuse my constant digressions, but bear with me, because while it may appear I'm going off way over on this tangent, and I'm circling back over here, and I'm going backward, and I'm going sideways, I'm actually all the time going forward. You will see, bear with me. And indeed he is. It's constantly, as the novel digresses, it progresses. It's very sentimental, but not in a mawkish way. And it's, I think most of all, it's a very forgiving novel. Stern is constantly, explicitly, but mostly implicitly telling the reader to forbear with people around you. That we all have our eccentricities, we all have our quirks, and as long as those quirks aren't harming anyone, let them be, and admire the passion behind them.
And there certainly are some quirks in this book.
Yes.
Some very
starting with the punctuation.
Well, the book that this most reminded me of was an even earlier novel, Don Quixote.
Yes, very much influenced by Don Quixote.
Yes.
He references Cervantes throughout.
He references Cervantes, he references Sancho Panza, he references the horse, Rocinante. Right. And they have that in common, though, don't they? That kind of postmodern, self-referential, the dubious narrator, or is that the word? Untrustworthy narrator?
Yeah, you could say that, because if most of the events in the book are taking place before Tristram Shandy's even born, how does he know that any of this took place? Lawrence Stern is aware, or I keep saying Lawrence Stern, Tristram Shandy, the author, is aware, the narrator is aware of this issue, and he says early on, oh yes, I know that you're probably wondering, how do I know all this? Well, my Uncle Toby told me.
Yeah.
But there are some events that even Uncle Toby couldn't possibly have known about. So
yes.
That's one of the conceits, I think, in the novel, one of the jokes that is constantly recurring.
So what do you think draws you to this book particularly? I mean, out of all the books that you could have come on to discuss, obviously you enjoy the book, you like the book, but what do you think makes it so important to you?
Well, when you first asked if I wanted to be on this podcast and what book I would discuss, I mentioned Moby Dick, but it had already been claimed by our friend Mike Sands.
Yes.
I would say that if I had to say, if someone asked me what's your desert island book, the one book you take to a desert island, I think it would be Tristram Shandy. There's just so much to untangle. And you really, I admit that if you read this book, you do need to get a copy that has some good footnotes or end notes, because there are references that are kind of lost to modern audiences. But you can put that aside and just focus on the main story. Throughout all the digressions and the side steps, there's this wonderful story about Uncle Toby, and his wound that he suffers. Uncle Toby is a soldier,
Yes.
who was wounded in 1695, somewhere around there, during the siege of Namur in Flanders. The wound was in his groin.
Yes.
A
Grievous wound.
A grievous wound. And it took Uncle Toby 3 or 4 years to recover from the wound. And so the novel follows his kind of, and Toby is a very modest man. He's a very kind man. Unlike Walter Shandy, Tristram's father, he's an unpretentious man. And he's follows his journey, and he becomes essential to his recovery from his wound is he develops what Tristram calls a hobby horse.
Yes.
Which is a passion, a hobby. And his manservant, Corporal Trim served with Uncle Toby in the British Army and was also wounded,
yes.
But in the knee, so not nearly as... Although there's a part in the novel where they have an argument on which is the more grievous wound, to be wounded in the knee or be wounded in the groin. I think most of us would agree.
Most of us would have a
groin.
pretty straightforward take on that.
But so it follows Toby, and he develops this, at Trim's suggestion, he develops this passion on fortifications in order to learn exactly how he was wounded and where he was wounded. So on a bowling green, a strip of lawn behind Toby's house, he and Trim construct the fortifications of Namur. And so that Toby can locate exactly where he was wounded. And that becomes a joke at the end of the novel. And then as the novel progresses, Tristram keeps telling us that, bear with me, dear reader, I'm getting to it, but very important to my book is the courtship of Uncle Toby with the widow Wadman.
Yes.
So eventually we get to that, and that's near the end of the book, this courtship between Uncle Toby and the widow Wadman, which ends with this terrible misunderstanding involving Uncle Toby's wound. And so he's just this fantastic character. I think everyone who's read the book just comes away loving Uncle Toby.
What do you think this book could tell us about the time and place that it was written? I mean, you guys both mentioned Don Quixote, but also Jonathan Swift. Swift was
right.
A big influence, and I can see some similarities in the takes, in the style and whatnot. So, what do you think?
Well, even the title is a play. It was very popular at the time in the 18th century with British novels to have a title, "The Adventures of" or "The History of." So, like even Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe, I think its real title, its official title, is something like The Surprising Adventures of Robinson Crusoe. So yeah, you had this. I guess we should mention that the novel at this point is really kind of coming into its own.
Right.
And it's looked down upon by the educated elite as a form of entertainment for the masses. But it already, by the time Lawrence Stern writes Tristram Shandy, it has developed certain, it follows certain models, there's certain conceits, there's certain rules that are being developed. And Stern he pokes fun at those.
Right.
Even in his title, it was, again, like I said, it was very popular at the time to title your books The Adventures of, or the life and history of. And by saying the life and opinions of, that's a poke at that conceit, because really Stern is not that interested in writing the life of Tristram Shandy. He's interested in just kind of going off, creating these sort of jokes and poking fun at everything that's in the air. And he keeps promising us, underneath this clothing, this surface profundity, he keeps promising us chapters on things like buttonholes and whiskers, but then never delivers. You know, that's part of the joke, too, of the novel. He promises all kinds of things throughout and then never delivers.
I wonder if you would mind...
I don't know if that answered your question.
I wonder if you'd mind reading to us from the very beginning of the novel.
Oh, yeah, we should say...
Brilliant beginning.
I love the beginning. We should say that, it begins, the novel, one of the great openings in British literature. The novel begins with Mr. Shandy and Mrs. Shandy doing the deed. And Mr. Shandy is interrupted by Mrs. Shandy because he's in the habit of once a month, on the first Sunday of the month, maybe it's the last Sunday of the month, I don't remember, of winding the clock, the big clock in the hallway, and then going upstairs and doing his husbandly duties. And so one Sunday when he's doing that, Mrs. Shandy, in the middle of the act, remembers, thinks to herself, I don't remember Walter winding the clock. And, oh dear, did you wind the clock? And that interrupts things. And Tristram considers that the source of all of his life's woes and issues that he's had in his life. So yeah, I could read that. It's a great beginning. Let me get to it.
Oh, yes. While Jody finds his place, I was just going to... Oh, okay, got it.
Okay.
Take it away, yes.
Okay. I wish either my father or my mother, or indeed both of them, as they were in duty both equally bound to it, had minded what they were about when they begot me. Had they duly considered how much depended upon what they were then doing, that not only the production of a rational being was concerned in it, but that possibly the happy formulation and temperature of his body, perhaps his genius in the very cast of his mind. And for aught they knew to the contrary, even the fortunes of his whole house might take their turn from the humors and dispositions which they were then uppermost. Had they duly weighed and considered all this, and proceeded accordingly, I am verily persuaded I should have made a quite different figure in the world from that in which the reader is likely to see me. Believe me, good folks, this is not so inconsiderable a thing as many of you may think it. You have all, I dare say, heard of the animal spirits, as how they are transfused from father to son, etc., etc., and a great deal to that purpose. Well, you may take my word that 9 parts in 10 of a man's sense or his nonsense, the successes and miscarriages in this world depend upon their motions and activity, and the different tracks and trains you put them into. So that when they are once set a-going, whether right or wrong, 'tis not a halfpenny matter. Away they go, cluttering like hay go mad, and by treading the same steps over and over again, they presently make a road of it, as plain and as smooth as a garden walk, which, when they are once used to, the devil himself sometimes shall not be able to drive them off it. Pray, my dear, quoth my mother, have you not forgot to wind up the clock? Good God, cried my father, making an exclamation, but taking care to moderate his voice at the same time. Did ever woman, since the creation of the world, interrupt a man with such a silly question? Pray, what was your father saying? Nothing?
Marvelous.
Fantastic.
Yes. So I think it might be the only great work of British literature that begins with coitus interruptus.
Coitus interruptus.
Fantastic. So yeah, I think back to what I was talking about, and I think this speaks to it. The works that have survived from that period as the touchstones for literature and art and that sort of thing seem to be very subversive from this. Poking fun at conventions,
Right.
Societal conventions in particular.
I said earlier, this novel was a huge hit.
Right.
It's like
Yeah.
an overnight sensation. But there were also those who considered it bawdy
Right.
and indecent and heavily criticized it for its focus on, well, there are these, nudge, nudge, wink, wink throughout.
Yeah.
References to noses and all kinds of things that could be interpreted as anything other than a nose. And at one point in the novel, Tristram Shandy stops and tells the reader, also Freudian before Freud, because he tells the reader at some point, all this stuff that I'm writing about noses, I mean noses. Sometimes a nose is just a nose.
Right. Yeah.
It's not what you may think it is, dear reader.
Yeah.
It's interesting to look back at that time period and realize that there is so much bawdy, even dirty content throughout a lot of literature. From Chaucer to Shakespeare, Swift, Cervantes. I mean, they were not Victorians. These were people who were living in a different period than.
Right. Well, one of the big hits of about 20 years before Tristram Shandy was Samuel Richardson's Pamela, which was a big hit. It's an epistolary novel. It's this 15, 16-year-old chambermaid or servant girl writing letters about her master trying to seduce her. And now that I mention this, I hope I'm not confusing Pamela with Richardson's other novel, Clarissa, but there's a scene in Pamela where, as she's writing, her master puts his hand on her breast. So because it's an epistolary novel, it means she is writing, oh my God, he's put his hand on her breast. And Henry Fielding, who wrote Tom Jones, another one of my favorite books from this period, he wrote a parody of Pamela called Shamala. And it is hilarious. It's one of the funniest books I've ever read. And when she mocks that whole idea of the epistolary novel. So it's within that climate that Stern is writing.
Yes.
The characters throughout, we've mentioned Walter Shandy, Tristram's father, and of course Uncle Toby, who's one of the great characters of all time. But there's also Parson Yorick. Is one of the characters. Parson Yorick is a clergyman in the region. He's kind of the Lawrence Stern stand.
And he's from Denmark.
Right. And there's Dr. Slupp, who is the man midwife, and Corporal Trim, Uncle Toby's answer. And then the widow Watson. There's Obadiah, a servant. He's a bit player. Susanna, a chambermaid. And so you've got these really funny secondary characters too who pop up throughout.
Yeah, you were saying that Stern was an obscure, not somewhat obscure, known in his district.
Known in his area.
And then the book comes out and is very successful.
Right.
His life is quite transformed by this.
Right. He becomes a literary sensation, and he begins spending more and more of his time in London. Stern also suffered from tuberculosis, consumption, as they called it. In fact, that would kill him in 1768. The reason there was so much time went by between the 5th and 6th volume and the 7th and 8th volume is because he spent most of that time traveling around France and Italy trying to
Take the waters.
relieve his tuberculosis. And out of those journeys, he not only produced kind of a travel parody that's part of Tristram Shandy, but he also wrote a book called A Sentimental Journey that was published just a month or two before he died. And I've only dipped into A Sentimental Journey, so I can't say much about it, but I know some people consider it also a masterpiece. But yeah, he basically was away from England for 3 or 4 years trying to relieve his symptoms. And he writes about that. It comes up occasionally in Tristram Shandy where Tristram writes about a burst vessel in his lung and how it has laid him low.
Yes. Yes.
When reading about this, I read a bit about the guy who translated this into Spanish, Javier Marias, and he mentions having read the book, and I just love this bit about, because we've all had this experience, right? Whether it's with a novel or a musical composition or something. It's like he said, having read this, it taught me that anything can be in a novel. It's like really like sort of, it's like I remember going to see Graham Reynolds play one time very early on and not realizing that is the kind of thing that could be done with music. Right. One of those experiences where you're like, oh, this changes everything.
Yeah, you can do that.
right. You can do that with music. You can do that with a novel.
Well, the big tragedies in Tristram's life that he writes about are really trivial in the end. There's the dispersal of the animal spirits, the coitus interruptus. His nose is, and that's one reason why nose is figured prominently throughout the book. His nose is crushed when Dr. Slop
that's right.
Because Dr. Slop uses forceps, which were then kind of a new thing. And there's a great argument between Mrs. Shandy and Walter Shandy. They have a prenup, what we would call a prenup, a marital arrangement, that if she were pregnant, she would get to lie in, as they call it in the book, in London, if she had access to good doctors. But there's a phrase or something in the marital agreement that if she has a false pregnancy or a pregnancy, maybe a miscarriage or something, then the next pregnancy she has to lie in the country. And so Tristram is that next pregnancy, and by the marital agreement, he's lying in country. Well, Mrs. Shandy insists that they have a woman midwife, who has a good reputation in the area, but Walter insisted on Dr. Slop, who's a man of education, scientific advancement, and he wants him to be present at the delivery. So it results in the crushing of Tristram's nose by the forceps. And then the other tragedy that occurs is the accidental circumcision of Tristram.
Right.
When the window sash, he's being watched by Susanna. He needs to pee. Susanna tells him just pee out the window. And as he's doing so, the window sash slams down and he is accidentally circumcised.
Yes.
There's also the issue with his name, too, right?
Oh, that's right, yes. And then there's the naming issue. His father insisted, he wanted to name him Trismegistus, which I'm not sure where that name comes from. I didn't bother to look it up.
There's some
I think
reference
it was
to
Egyptian.
some mythology or something.
It has some ancient classical.
Right. Yeah.
But his father considered, whatever you do, for God's sake, don't name him Tristram. It is the worst name. So when the time for naming Tristram comes, Walter is lying in bed and he needs to put on his breeches, but the naming needs to take place right then and there because they think Tristram is going to die. And so Walter tells Susanna, all right, while I'm putting on my breeches, tell the parson that the name is Trismegistus. Can you do that? Can you do that? Yes, I can do that. Well, she can't. She says, the name is Tris something, and the parson, oh, Tristram? Yeah, that sounds right. And so he gets this name, which Walter Shandy considers the worst name anyone can possibly have. And then to make up for it, Walter decides to educate Tristram by creating the Tristopedia, an encyclopedia of everything Walter Shandy knows about the world and life, to dedicate himself to teaching Tristram from the Tristopedia.
You know what the Tristopedia reminds me of is the memory machine in the book 100 Years of Solitude. Do you remember that?
Not really. I've read the book, but I don't really remember.
There is a plague of insomnia in the book, 100 Years of Solitude, and as a result of the plague, everyone just stays awake all the time, and no one feels the slightest bit tired, so they're quite comfortable not sleeping, except they all start to lose their memory. And so one of the characters starts to make a memory machine, which is essentially like a book, that is everything that he can remember before he forgets it. And it has filled with these wonderful little entries about, these sort of ludicrous descriptions of what various things are and what they mean. And they're always slightly cockeyed, but it's great. It reminds me of that.
Yeah, there's, I didn't, as I reread this, I didn't stop and read every footnote or go check all the endnotes, so I can't say what is real and what isn't real from the Tristopedia or any of the references. You know that some of them are made up, some of them are satiric takes on real events and are real people and real books, and then some of them are sincere.
And this is probably
which, I'm not sure.
not too long after the invention of the encyclopedia, right? I mean,
Yeah, Stern, I think, was a big fan of encyclopedias. Collection.
The Diderot encyclopedia, and very interesting time in history, wasn't it? It was just so much coming to be known and recorded, and so much to make fun of.
And this was a time of, candlelight and chamber pots and sewage running in the streets. You can imagine what it must have been like.
Yeah, it's I think that that's probably a part of why there's so much scatological humor and these kind of references.
Yeah, in the 18th century, you do stumble across a lot of scatological humor in the novels from that period.
And just and not just humor, but just references that we would be surprised to see nowadays. And I think that it probably is part of it is that they live very close to that kind of thing. I mean, famously in London, if you walked down the street, you had to keep your eye on the sky because someone might empty his chamber pot out the window right onto you. It was a perfectly normal thing to do.
But I think what's interesting, though, is the sort of philosophical, atmosphere of the time, too, was that man was the pinnacle of creation.
Yes.
It was very human-centric, sort of philosophical take on things, how man is so fantastic and had this very proper air about how fantastic we are as human beings, and we figured everything out by now, right? That technology is making advances at the time, and we're starting to sort of elevate ourselves. And in that, what Jonathan Swift is getting at with the Gulliver's Travels bit is that pointing at
Pre-industrial revolution,
right,
just before the industrial revolution.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, but the societal. It's like the gentlemanly kind of, we're proper and we're not animals, right? That we're different from that.
And the class divisions. I mean, you see, even though Toby is a kind, wonderful person, Trim is always addressing him as, if it pleases your honor.
Right.
May I speak?
Right.
And of course, Toby has no issue with Trim. He's always happy to hear Trim speak. But there's in Trim, being of a lower class, he's always, and it pleases your honor, if it pleases your honor.
Sure.
Yes.
But you mentioned the scatological humor, and I think that sort of flies in the face of the aristocracy in that sense. That it's like, no, we're filthy. We are animals.
Yeah.
And it's
the importance of religion at the time. It figures prominently in the book. The church, philosophical debates about religion.
right.
And who has a soul and who doesn't have a soul.
Yes.
Toby comes down on the side. There's a conversation near the end between Trim and Toby. Maybe it's Walter and Toby. And Toby comes down on the side that everyone has a soul. Of course, we're all children of God. But the person he's talking about is not sure about that. That maybe only good Englishmen have.
Right. Which I think we can agree is probably the right position. Right?
No, I side with Toby.
Oh, you do? Well, excuse me.
I side with Toby on most things.
That's probably a good policy. Well, if I'm not mistaken, the sky is starting to get dark.
I can see some flashes on the horizon. It's like the lightning coming.
Yeah, it's. I think I hear the sound of thunder rolling in.
Are you ready for the lightning round, Jody?
I guess so. If the thunder's rolling in, I may have to hide quivering.
Yes, that's
well,
fine.
before you take off, before you start go into your hiding spot, I've got some questions for you.
Okay.
Rapid fire style.
Well, like Tristram, I think it will be impossible for me to answer these rapid fire, but I will.
Without some digressions.
I will endeavor to do so, good sir.
All right, fantastic.
With your worship's permission.
Okay, well, number one then. Tell us about the very first time you fell in love with a book.
You know, my mom, I grew up in a house. We didn't have a lot of books. See, it's impossible for me.
You don't have to answer quickly.
It would be the Childcraft collection of books. I don't know if you know what.
I do. That rings a big bell.
I grew up in a house. We didn't have a lot of books around. My parents aren't readers, but for some reason, when I was 5 or 6 years old, my mom felt compelled to buy a set of World Book encyclopedias and the accompanying Childcraft collection. And there's one volume in that Childcraft collection on fables and myths. And I think that's where I fell in love with reading.
That's like one of those time machine things. You mentioned Childcraft books with the World Book set, and that just sent me way back. I loved those books. Volume 4 was the Make and Do book, and that was the one I liked because it had all kinds of crafts and stuff.
The illustrations in those books were marvelous.
Yeah.
Wonderful. I can still see the illustrations.
Wow, Make and Do.
In the encyclopedia, I mean, for the rest of my time at home before I left to go to college, I must have probably read that World Book encyclopedia through, A through Z.
Really?
Like Stern.
Yeah.
Like Stern, I developed the love for encyclopedias.
They had a big, beautiful section on the moon landing that I loved to read through.
Space exploration.
I think I traced those drawings 20 times each.
And the edition we had was published before the moon landing, so it was kind of still based, those drawings were based on what they thought.
Artist's impression.
Artist's impression.
You know who else was like that is the beautiful blonde woman in Dr. No. Do you remember he encounters Ursula Andress on the beach, and she says that she's never been among polite society or any society, never been to school, but she's been reading the Encyclopedia Britannica, and she's up to tea or something, and she says, and I bet I know a lot more things than you do.
Man, Childcraft. Okay, great answer. Has a book ever changed your mind about anything?
Every book I read changes my mind. It completely revises my outlook on it.
I love it. Well, then, so the bigger brother question after that is, has a book ever changed your life?
Yeah, I would say Tristram Shandy. Well, that's a good question because, like Tristram Shandy is one of those books that has stuck with me for 40 years. So obviously, it has affected my life in some way. But did it change it, or did it just reinforce pre-existing thoughts and assumptions and conditions? I don't know. But, I would consider Tristram Shandy one of those books. Moby Dick's one of those books. I'm a big fan of Moby Dick. I like Tom Jones. I mentioned Tom Jones earlier.
If I could jab my own bolt of lightning in here, can you tell us one or two of the ideas you had that may or may not have been reinforced by this book, or else views on the world that you.
I think it's sort of an absurdist novel. Mm-hmm. I've always considered myself a bit of an absurdist, and so anything that has that touch of absurdism to it usually appeals to me.
Wonderful.
Has a book ever made you cry?
I am a cold, heartless bastard. I don't cry at anything. I'm as dead inside as dead can be.
You and Graham Reynolds. He also wouldn't admit to shedding a tear over literature.
I believe him.
I'm sure there's a book out there that I've read that's made me cry, but I can't think of it.
Is there let me take this a step further. Is there a genre that you're more apt to cry over? Have you? I mean, like
medium.
A medium, sure. Yes, I'm sorry. A song, a film.
Probably film.
Film.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll tear up over movies.
All right.
Cry, baby.
Okay.
Yeah, of course, I try not to show it.
Yeah, well, too late.
Tell us about a book that you have read more than once.
Well, Tristram Shandy. Thomas Hardy. I'm a big Thomas Hardy fan. In fact, I thought about it. I think we discussed, LB, that I might do a Hardy novel. I settled on Tristram Shandy. The Return of the Native. Thomas Hardy is one of my favorite books.
Okay, then here comes the final question of our lightning round, the big one. Do you have any poetry committed to memory?
Peace on earth, we sing it and pay 1,000,000 priests to bring it. After 2,000 years of mass, we've come as far as poison gas.
Nice. Who's that, E.E. Cummings?
That is Thomas Hardy.
Oh, Thomas Hardy. Look at that.
I can probably, pull couplets and snippets here and there from various poetry poems, but that's a good short one.
I like it.
Sums up Hardy about as well as anything.
Brilliant. Brilliant.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, this has been fun. Thanks for having me.
Of course, that was a great conversation.
Go out and read it, folks.
Read the book. Read my book while you're at it, called Why So Much by Lance Myers.
Yeah, really, what are you waiting for? Why have you not read Why So Much? Why have you not read Tristram Shandy?
Or The Goddamn Fool, for that matter.
Fool.
Come on now.
And if you don't want to read Tristram Shandy, check out Michael Winterbottom's movie of Tristram Shandy.
Yes, and check out Michael Winterbottom's movie of Why So Much.
And the Goddamn
Fool.
It's coming out next year.
Yeah, probably coming out.
Probably. Are you still working on the audiobook? Are we going to have an audiobook of The Goddamn Fool?
The audiobook is in progress.
I'm really looking forward to the
As far as you know.
audiobook.
Yes.
Fantastic. Okay, thanks for joining us.
Thank
also,
you, Jody Seaborn.
Yes, thank you, Jody, and thank you for listening, and thank you for checking out our website, which is POV-Publishing.com. There you can see all the links to our former podcasts, and we'll see you there.
And
Bye.
Please, ladies and gentlemen, remember to wind the clock before you get started.